down on earth and he actually lived that perfect obedient life so that he could be that perfect sacrifice for us as well. And that's the reason for his humanity. So it's sort of this dual nature, if you will, of being God as well as together is really the we saw some heretical teachings popping up, right? And so at the church in Colossae at that time, you sort of had this sort of soup, if you will, of Jewish legalism as well as mystic paganism, right? And then we started to see this new found sort of Gnosticism popping up, right? Where you see that, spiritual things are good, but human things are bad, right? And so therefore Gnostics would say Jesus wasn't actually human, right? As a result of that, right? And we can't do that, right? We just talked about why those two things are so important. But Paul, I think really understood that if you get Jesus wrong, nothing else matters, right? You have to get Jesus right and correct. And so that's why this week we're going to get into a little bit about Christology. And so this week we're going to be going through 6 major Christological statements about who Jesus is. And so again, the topic for today is Jesus is the center of everything. And that's really what we'll be talking through today. What does that mean? What does that mean that Jesus is the center of everything? And so with that, we will have our first reading.
The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him.
Short readings in the New Testament, right? Not quite as long as Exodus. Easier names, exactly. So kind of truth number 1, right, is Jesus is the perfect image of God. He's the perfect image of God. And so what we're talking about here is that Jesus, as he came down to earth, he was in fact the mirrored representation of the invisible God. And I don't know about you guys, but just that thought to me, it's just like, it's enough to explode your mind that our God, who we can't see, became one of us, right? And actually became that mirrored representation of God. It's just fascinating to me. But we also know that as human beings, right, if you go back to Genesis 1, verses 26 and 27, where sort of we see the triune God talking about, let us create man in our image, right? Let us make them male and female, et cetera, et cetera. So we know as well that we were also created in the image of God, right? But we also know that when sin entered the world, our image became distorted, right? And so I know last week Russell talked a little bit about the Six Flags that he would go to it, when he was young, and antique cars, right? And it reminds me as well as I think about our image of God, when you go to an amusement park and you go through one of the funny mirror, right, mazes, right? And you look in those mirrors and you see the distortion of yourself. It reminds me of that because that is who we are, right? We were created to be like God, right? To be representations of him on this earth, but yet we've distorted that with sin. And so that's image number 1, or truth number 1. Jesus is the perfect image of God. Truth number 2 is Jesus is supreme over all things. And so as we look at the reading again today, some might look at that and say, well, this means Jesus was in fact created, right? It's not what it's saying, right? It's actually saying, and the key word there is over, right? That he is the firstborn over all creation, meaning he is actually over all things that were created. And so with that, we see that Jesus outranks all things, right? All things he outranks them. And in fact, the verses here that Paul's writing are really meant to distinguish Jesus from creation, right? Not make him part of creation. So he actually is the creator, not one of the created. And so when we combine that with the following verse that we read through, we see that Jesus was also before all things, right? So he was before all things, and he is king and ruler and supreme over all things. And so, as we think about the fact that our God humbled himself and took on flesh for us, right? That should sort of, again, stir in us this sort of, like we talked about last week, this thankfulness for what he did, and sort of, again, make us want to praise him even more and more. Okay, so that's truth number 2. Truth number 3 is Jesus is the origin and the purpose of all things. Okay, so again, we saw here in these verses that he's the creator of all things, and the fact that all things were created in him and through him and for him means that every aspect of creation was his idea, right? He's the one who spoke it all into existence. And so all things on this earth find their meaning and their creation and their purpose in him, right? And so again, as we think about Jesus being the center of everything, he's not only the perfect representation of our God, he's not only supreme over all things, but he's also the purpose, right, in all of our lives, or he should be the purpose in all of our lives. Because when you think about it, and I don't know about you guys, but I've experienced this in my life, and I certainly experienced it in the 30 years that I've lived not following Jesus, that anything that chooses to find a purpose outside of Jesus will lead to ruin and destruction, right? It just will. And that's because Jesus created, right? And I don't remember who said this, but I heard this recently, someone describing that if you were to see a new invention, right, for the very, very first time, you had never seen it before, didn't know what it was, and someone showed it to you, and they said, what do you do with this? What is this for? You'd probably be hard-pressed to say what that thing's for. I don't know what that's for, right? Well, who could tell you what that was for? Creator, right? Whoever created that thing. It's no different with us, right? Jesus is the creator, and therefore through him and in him we find our purpose. And so one of the things I think for us to think about today is of these 3 attributes, and I don't know if you guys normally do any discussion at all while these are going on, but maybe a question, and someone can shout out if they feel like they want to, but of these 3 attributes, right? So Jesus being the perfect image of God, being supreme over all things, and also being the origin and the purpose of all things. Any of those things kind of jump out at you in terms of, resonating with you, or why? Yeah.
The term firstborn, it has to be, because it's used twice here, so what would it have meant to them? I mean, obviously to us, it means the firstborn of faith, but it seems like it means something else.
Yeah, so the term firstborn, right? And so again, I think it's important for us to, and this is why in the Bible too, it's really important that you read, what did it say before that verse? What did it say after that verse? What do we already know in the Bible about Jesus? And so if you continue reading, right, the firstborn over all creation, right? And so again, what it's saying is that he was there, existed before creation, right? And that he, in essence, is over all of creation, right? And so, yeah.
Yeah, I saw a video where it talked about how like DNA is actually like software code.
Yeah.
And so that means we're created, so there has to be a creator.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, people talk a lot about just the complex nature of a single cell, right? And then inherently, a single cell is so complex that to think that it just happened by chance, it really takes a lot more faith if you think about it, right? Than actually believing that it was put there by someone who intended it and actually wired into it its purpose, right? So yeah, that's good. Okay, so those are the first three truths, and now we're going to get into our second reading.
He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all things, all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross.
All right. Get excited about these verses. I like these. So again, we see that Jesus not only created all things intentionally, but what we learn in these verses from the Apostle Paul is that he also holds all things together, right? And again, it's like so if you think about, sometimes you hear people talk about the God that they believe in, right? And that their God might be more impersonal in nature, right? Well, this notion that our God is sort of detached, right? Or not involved in the inworkings and outworkings of just life and what's going on in life is just false, right? It's patently false because Jesus is involved, right? He didn't just create and then walk away, right? That's not at all what he did. But these verses tell us that not only did he create, but that he's also taking an active role in sustaining, right? And so that's our truth number 4, is that Jesus is the sustainer of all things. Jesus is the sustainer of all things. So these verses really assure us that nothing is really happening. Nothing is happening in this world that Jesus isn't a part of. Right, apart from his sustaining, if you will. And so for us, right, this should really serve as hope, right, as confidence that even when we see terrible things happening, right, we just celebrated the 20-year anniversary of 9/11, right, I mean, horrible things happen in our world. But what should give us hope is that Jesus, we know, is there, right? He's never far away, and he is, in fact, sustaining this world. So I think we also see that in Romans 8:28. And so some of you may be familiar with Romans 8:28, but it reads like this. It says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Right? And so even when we can't see what he's doing, even when we can't see that what's happening is actually good, we know that for those who believe in him, he is using those things for good, right? I talked about with you last time I was here that I was on my second marriage and I was separated from my wife for 2 years. And I promise you that when all of that happened and started, I could not see the good that God was doing, right? And it wasn't until in the midst of that I humbled myself to the point of asking him to come into my life. And now looking back on it today, it's like, that's the greatest thing that ever happened to me. It's the greatest thing that ever happened to me, and it's the closest that I've ever been to God when that was going on. So again, these passages should serve as that hope for us, that even when we can't see it, Jesus is sustaining all things. Okay, truth number 5. Jesus is the ruler of all things. Jesus is the ruler of all things. So these verses talk about how Jesus is the head and the ruler of the church, right? Of us as a church family, Jesus is our head. And so as such, the church really exists. Why? To make much of Jesus, right? To make much of him. And so while we're sort of the members, right, of the church, the members of the body parts, if you will, right? The ligaments, the arms, the legs, etc., right? Jesus is the head, right? And each of us, we should sort of be joining together as the Lord has equipped us, right? We may have talked last time about, figuring out what your spiritual gifts are, but we should each be working as the Lord has equipped us to submit to him and to serve him, right? But it's interesting because it's not just the living, right? It's not just the living, it's also the dead. Have you ever thought about that? Jesus is actually the ruler over the dead as well, right? Like Jesus is the only one that can give the dead new life, right? He's the only one who can do that. And so we see that in Jesus's death and in his resurrection, he conquered death. He conquered death once and for all. And so again, this also should be a great comfort to us, right? That Jesus has conquered death, that Jesus, what he did is ultimately going to be the final word, right? But I think it should also be a challenge for us. It should also be a challenge for us, for those in our lives who maybe don't know Jesus, right? Who don't have that same hope that we have, that we might share that hope, right, with them. And so again, as we think about these ideas together, as we sort of join in as the body of Christ, again, Jesus is that source of life, right? Jesus is that head, and those who haven't joined in to that family essentially are walking around, for lack of a better term, headless, right? They're dead in their trespasses. They don't have that same life-giving head source that we have. Okay, so that's truth number 5. And lastly, truth number 6, Jesus is the rescuer of all things. Jesus is the rescuer of all things. And so we see in John 1:1, right, where it talks about how the Word became flesh, right? The Word dwelt among us, right? And as a result, God saved, right? God saved through that action. So again, we see that Jesus had to be not only God, but that he also had to be man in order to be that perfect substitution for us, right? And so therefore, right, if you were to look in John 14, it talks about how Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, right? The way, the truth, and the life, and no one can come to the Father except through Jesus, right? No one can come to the Father except through Jesus. And so again, right, rather than remaining headless or spiritually dead, if you will, Jesus is the only way to truly restore the creation, right? It's the only way to truly restore the creation. And so some people might ask questions like, well, why didn't God just forgive everyone? Right? Wouldn't that have been a lot easier, and wouldn't that be so great if God would just forgive everyone? Why this elaborate plan, right? Well, I think, again, if you learn about the nature of God, his holiness, right? His righteousness, his just behavior, right? He cannot be anything but those things, right? Every aspect of God is perfect and holy. And so it was necessary, right? It was necessary for Jesus to come and live the life that he lived. It was necessary that he came and died the way that he died. It was necessary for him to raise from the dead like he did. These were all necessary things. And so for us, if we look at Jesus and we take any of these things away, right? If you take away that he was God, if you take away that he was man, if you take away any of these attributes that we're talking about, you don't really have Jesus at all, right? You don't have a Savior like we have in Jesus. And so my question for us, and again, you can shout out if you want, is as we learn about these things, as we learn about God by studying the person and the work of Jesus, what do we learn about God? What do we learn about God by what the Apostle Paul is telling us here? Anybody?
I learned, like verse 17, what I learned there is that God has all things held together. And as crazy as the world is right now, trying to maneuver and navigate through COVID-19 and different parts of the world, things are completely falling apart.
Yeah.
But he's got it all held together.
He's holding it together. Yeah. Yeah, I promise you, COVID-19 did not surprise God.
Right.
Didn't, right? Didn't. What else? What else did they learn about God?
That he blessed Jesus. It says he was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him and through him. So he kind of gave Jesus, although they're three in one, Jesus was still the Son. And he gave all the authority to Jesus.
Yeah, he blessed Jesus. Yeah, and you know, the other thing I think we see by just watching the way Jesus lived his life, how many times did Jesus say, I'm doing this because my Father said, right? Like again, right, if you think back to Exodus, right, and pretty much the whole entire Old Testament, how much disobedience constantly, but yet Jesus did exactly what the Father asked him to do, right? And the Father blessed him, right? Blessed that. I think the biggest thing that jumps out to me that I learn about God by reading these passages is that he loves us, right? He loves his creation, right? He didn't just create this robot and send it off, right? That he's actually loving us, and in what he's been doing all throughout time is working his plan of restoration out, right? He didn't have to send Jesus. He didn't have to send his son to die for us. Lord knows I wouldn't have, right? After seeing all that disobedience, I would not feel like sending my child to go die for these disobedient people. Exactly. Right? So he loves us, right? He's trustworthy, right? He did exactly what he said he was going to do back in the Garden of Eden, right? He said, I am going to crush the head of the serpent. He did with Jesus. He's trustworthy. We can trust Jesus like we can trust no other in this world. He's forgiving. Right? I think we see that he's forgiving. He's patient. Right? Amazing things that we learn about our God from reading these passages. Okay. Reading number 3.
Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your path, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out of the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant.
All right. It's interesting that term, you were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. I know Russell mentioned last week that sometimes he goes off on tangents, so we'll go off on another tangent here. But like when I think about my life that I lived apart from Jesus and apart from God, I don't know that I would have considered myself an enemy of God, right? But I really was, right? My behavior in no way reflected the fact that he created me and the fact that he died for me. In no way reflected that, right? And so I think I probably was an enemy, right? I certainly wasn't on his team, right? I certainly wasn't trying to get more team members on the team. I think that's interesting to think about. And as I was reading these passages this week, the thought that popped into my mind was that not following Jesus is not a passive thing, right? It's not something that just happens to happen, right? Like people who aren't following Jesus are really making a choice. They're making a deliberate choice not to follow him. So again, that's off script, but it's just, I think that's important for us to think about, that we have to proactively follow Jesus. You know, I think I talked to you guys last time about how I'm super introverted, right? That I can't even believe I'm standing up in front of you right now. That's a choice that I have to make every single week. Every single time I get an invite to stand up here, I am nervous as all get out. right? But I'm making a choice. And so I think that's important for us to think about, that you really have to choose to be on God's team, right? And so I think too, it's also true, I would say, that we can live our lives however we want to. Right? I was talking to a family member not that long ago, and she was saying to me how people can live however they want, right? They can believe whatever they believe, and that's okay, and I'm okay with that. And my comment back was, I agree with you. Everyone has the freedom to choose to believe whatever they want to believe. I don't disagree that people have the freedom to do that. But the question isn't whether you have the freedom to believe it. The question is, what is true? What is actually true? And I think when you study about Jesus and who he was and how he lived and how he died and how he rose, it's truth, right? And what's more loving than to tell people about that truth? Right? Because I think failing to surrender and to humble yourself to God and to Jesus really just means that we're going to continue to be that distorted image of God, right? Forever and ever and ever. We're going to continue to be that distorted image of God. And it's only through him and what he did that the picture will begin to become clear. So as we read these verses this morning, they do proclaim who Jesus is, right? They give us a right understanding of who Jesus is and what he did for us. And as a result, what that means, right? The hope and the good news that brings to us as humanity. And so with that, again, if you guys are following along in the fill in the blanks, it's sort of the therefore statement, right? Therefore, knowing all these things about Jesus, right? He's the sustainer, he's the ruler, he's the rescuer. Knowing all these things, Jesus is truly the only one who's worthy of all our devotion, of all our service, of all our worship. So maybe just a couple of final questions. What do you guys think it looks like in our lives to live a life like that, to live a life of full service, full devotion, full worship to Jesus? What does that even look like?
I just had something pop in my head from scripture that everybody knows about. My word is where the rock will cry out. And I just feel like sometimes we need to do that more. Obviously, we're like the rock covering, and we just need to open up and cry out. You know, we have a son-in-law with his spouse. He's crying out, he's making signs, he's putting bumpers on his car, he's doing stuff right now. And we're like, why are we doing that?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we just need to speak about Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, I think there's no right or wrong way necessarily, right? It's going to look different for everybody.
That way's not necessarily my way, but he's
Yeah.
doing it. But
Yeah. Like it goes back to what we talked about last week, right? Do other people even know that you know Jesus? Right? Sometimes it's as easy as just sharing with people what you know and the hope that you have. Right? And it's not always going to be on our timetable, but sometimes on their timetable, again, they might start to come around. Right?
I would say it's fruits of the spirit.
Fruits of the Spirit, yeah.
Evident in your life.
Yes.
I would say like
Yeah. Fruit of the Spirit. Yeah, we have it on our kitchen wall. Read it often, especially the patience part. Yeah, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. Yeah. I mean, those are things that I mean, in fact, I was teaching this morning, and one of the young ladies who's an elementary school teacher said that after last week's lesson, she wrote all those things down, fruit of the Spirit, and she's keeping it on her desk at school as she's teaching the kids, right? Just as a reminder that these are the things that I should be exhibiting in my life if I'm truly a follower of Jesus. Right? That was awesome.
Also, the last, just being servant. Christianity always to lead is to serve.
Yeah.
Just having that kind of mindset.
Yeah. Being a servant. That's hard. I can tell you, being in corporate America, you know, I mean, there is this notion of servant leadership out there, but it's hard, right, to just serve, right? But again, when we look at Jesus, it's like, that's why he's our example. That's what he did perfectly, right? And so we know we're not going to do that perfectly. We know we're not going to do it like Jesus. But what we should is we should have a heart and a desire to want to do more like Jesus every single day. Right? And I believe that if you have that heart, you're going to be conformed more and more into his image over time. All right, well, that's what I had for this lesson, gang. So again, thank you for having me back. It's always a pleasure to be with you guys. And with that, I will yield my time back.
All right. Hey, Joe, so much easier